Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, born in 1588 in southern England, born into a period of time that was characterized by immense turmoil, so much so that historians looking back on this period have called it the era of religious warfare. And Hobbes was well attuned to the strife that engulfed Europe, not just England, but Spain and the Holy Roman Empire and France during this time. The precise circumstances of Hobbes's birth in 1588 need, I think, to be examined closely because they constitute a kind of metaphor for his whole political philosophy. One of Hobbes's contemporaries, John Aubrey, who was a chronicler of lives during that period, Hobbes included, talked about the circumstances of Hobbes' entry into this world. He says the day of Hobbes's birth was April the 5th, 1588, on a Friday morning, which that year was Good Friday. His mother fell in labor with him upon the fright of the invasion of the Spaniards. That was the circumstance of Hobbes's birth. And it's significant because it constitutes a kind of metaphor, not just for Hobbes' situation, but for his whole political philosophy, as we'll see. We need to picture the scene in order to appreciate this story of Hobbes' entry into the world. The Spanish Armada set sail to make war on England, and it was a magnificent fortress on the sea. 30,000 men, 2,400 pieces of artillery, the most magnificent war machine that the world had seen thus far. As it loomed off the coast of southern England, there it was, the banners of the Holy Virgin flying, and England about to make war with Spain. Think of it, we'd be all speaking Spanish now, it said, if the English had been defeated. But the Armada failed. However, Hobbes's mother didn't know at that time that it was going to fail, and so the first sight of the Spanish Armada looming up there, the coast of England, she's only 7 months pregnant with Hobbes, but the fright was so terrible that she delivered, the midwife being fear. And Hobbes said, much later on in life, when he looked back upon that circumstance or imagined that event, I could look back on it, but he certainly imagined it, and he said that unbeknownst to my mother at that time, she gave birth to twins, myself and fear has been my constant companion throughout my life. Now, fear becomes, for Hobbes's philosophy, a way of thinking, a form of behavior, a bottom-line passion that, as we'll see, explains more about what he has to say, human nature and the character of political events, than any other single quality. A student of mine was so impressed by this that in an exam he said that Hobbes's philosophy begins with the Armada complex. And while the Armada complex might not be the best description of Hobbes's philosophy, nevertheless it goes far to explain where we're at. Hobbes was sensitive to the world around him, to the war around him, to the terrible strife around him, and there was plenty to be fearful of. At that time, not only did we have enormous international warfare, continuing international warfare in the late 16th and throughout the 17th centuries, but there was the most fierce, ferocious civil war fought during the time that Hobbes was composing the Leviathan that England had ever seen. Remember that Charles I literally lost his head in England. The sitting monarch lost to Oliver Cromwell in the Puritan Revolution. And when we think about the way in which that civil war was fought and how Hobbes loathed and detested not just Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution, but the way in which the quality of violence had seeped so much into the British character, his concern was to cope with that, to come up with a solution for the illness, for the virus that was so much in Britain at that time. What we'll do today in these two lectures on Hobbes is to talk first about his diagnosis of the ills that plague humanity, and particularly Britain at this time, but he speaks in universal terms of all human nature. We'll talk about the way in which he looks at this situation and tries to examine human nature as it is. And then, in the second lecture, we'll look at his remedy, that is, the way in which he sees a solution for the problem. The two closely paired, obviously, as they should be, because Hobbes thought of himself as essentially a physician, a scientist who was diagnosing the ills of humanity and then after that coming up with an appropriate prescription. He wanted to help us, and for all of the stern, severe diagnoses that he will make of human nature, we must keep that in mind. Hobbes was basically a timid individual who looked on human nature and saw it in a sad light, tragic sense. And so when he comes up with the solution, with the remedy, it's to help, to cure, to administer to people who are desperately in need. We go, first of all, to his great work, of course, the Leviathan. The Leviathan, a brilliant book because of its systematic, its logical tightness, the way in which it sets forth in such a cohesive manner, first the problem and then the solution. When we speak of the problem, Hobbes introduces his main themes in the introduction of the Leviathan. Now we can't miss it because he says right away, we're speaking of, this is a main theme in his thought, the great Leviathan, called a commonwealth or a state or a civitas in Latin. The idea of the Leviathan is new for Hobbes, new for political philosophy. Leviathan, as you know, in biblical sense means a sea monster, a huge object flying through the deep or swimming through the oceans, a whale or whatever. And it's a nice term, seems to me, because it has this sort of dual meaning that's just right for Hobbes. On the one hand, we stand in awe of this sea monster of the Leviathan. But on the other hand, and this is what Hobbes wants us to see, we go to a object of this kind for protection, perhaps. If we can enlist the help of the Leviathan, if we can somehow bring in the Leviathan, make friends with it, and use it as a way of guarding and protecting us, then all the better. And that's precisely what he's trying to say in the Leviathan. The Leviathan is this vast state, as we'll see. And on the one hand, we're to stand in awe of that state, and that sense of awe will never stop. On the other hand, we're to enlist the aid of the state in order to protect us. It's a protective measure. Hobbes says that he's talking about the Leviathan, yes, but his specific themes that he announces in the introduction are, first, matter, or the material composition of human nature. This we'll contrast later on with Plato. Remember Plato in the Republic when we discussed earlier in our series the way in which Plato describes human nature. Plato characterizes it in terms of reason, and he looks upon human nature with a sense of reverence because human nature, from Plato's point of view, has the stuff, the potential to set up an ideal state, a state characterized by virtue in which individual guardians or men of reason, women of reason too, may rule. Hobbes begins by describing human nature first and foremost just as matter. And then after matter, there is the idea of the covenant. We're to construct this matter in a certain way so that we will be able to enter into a contract together. And that contract represents the best, really, that we can create. It's a contract not based upon reason, but just based upon human nature as it is. We give to that contract all that we have, but it's not based upon rational deliberation. It's based upon a passionate embrace. And finally, he says, we want to discuss in this book, after the Leviathan, after the idea of human nature, after the concept of the covenant or the contract, we want to discuss the power and the authority of the sovereign. The sovereign, our leader in the Leviathan, is the one who is going to be at the head of this rescue operation. On the next page of the introduction, when he's speaking further about matter and the way in which human nature is characterized by that, he says matter is comprised, especially in human nature, of passion. And there are two passions that he mentions particularly in this introduction, and these two we'll want to keep well in mind because we'll be analyzing them closely in a moment. And the first, of course, is desire, and the second is fear. Now, certainly we cannot be surprised about fear. But desire, as we'll see in a moment, takes on finer forms. In part one of the book, as he begins, leaving the introduction, he speaks of the thoughts of man, and how the original of them all is what we call sense. For there is no conception in man's mind which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. The cause of sense is the external body or object which presseth the organ proper to each sense, either immediately as in the sense of taste or touch, or immediately as in seeing, hearing, and smelling. This is the stuff of human nature. We are sensual and not rational animals. We're engaged now in an empirical analysis of human nature and what makes us tick. Passions, the senses. And the senses are all important in terms of getting to us and explaining why we are at war, why we should continually self-destruct. If the senses are, from Hobbes' point of view, at the bottom of our behavior, and the passions explain the reasons why we are where we are, what about reason? Hobbes, certainly thinking back to Plato, the quintessential rationalist, says about reason, well, for reason is nothing but reckoning, he says, in the beginning of the Leviathan. That is, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed upon for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. It's nothing more than a calculator, a way of figuring out which passions are strongest, the passions of, as we'll see, aversion or the passions of appetite. Reason does no more than that, no more than calculate one side or the other. And when he's speaking of reason, he talks about it as nothing more than a calculator, or, as he says, it serves us little in common life, in which we are governed, some better, some worse, according to our differences of experience, quickness of memory, inclinations to several ends, but above all by our passions. Now that marks Hobbes' realism. And if we want to make a sharp contrast, which I'll be doing, between Hobbes and Plato, we'll want to contrast Hobbes the realist with Plato the idealist. I suggest that the first point, maybe the most significant of all points, that can be made in this contrast is between Hobbes, the advocate of passions, that is, that we are sensual animals, and Plato, the advocate of reason, that is, we are basically rational animals. We happen to have Plato with us, his Republic, which we used some time ago in this series, and I regard it as a kind of sacred text. In the middle of the Republic of Plato, as the rationalist says, it will be the business of reason to rule with wisdom and forethought on behalf of the entire soul. The just man is a rational man who does not allow the several elements in his soul to usurp one another's functions. He is indeed one who sets his house in order by self-mastery, discipline, and reason. Now that's Plato's wisdom. Plato's idea is that, in contrast to Hobbes, or we should say Hobbes in contrast to Plato, because Hobbes is responding to Plato, Plato believes that the just state, the right order, can be created insofar as we set up a hierarchy within our souls of reason ruling the passions. Remember, the tripartite soul for Plato is reason on top, and then spirit, and then desire. The just person and the just polis is that person or polis in which reason rules. From Hobbes' point of view, reason cannot rule. It cannot rule because we're sensual, passionate animals and not rational types. And reason at best can perform a service of reckoning, calculating. So we go then to this basic contrast. And as we make that contrast, we want to reiterate that it's the basis of the realism-idealism schools of thought. For Plato, the idealist, given the right kind of rule by rational creatures, we can create a state based on virtue. With the right kind of education, anything is possible. We can get out of the cave and into the sunlight. From the point of view of Hobbes, It's quite the opposite. The state can never attain virtue. The state is given only to one aim, and that is security. Security, order, safety, survival. That's what we want. And Hobbes does not speak, as Plato says, about the just person. He speaks about the individual who manages to maintain a state of balance in the soul that keeps him out of war, that allows him to survive, that enables him to be secure. That's the essence of it. Well, in chapter 4 of part 1 of the Leviathan, Hobbes now takes us a step further in the journey. The chapter is on the passions, specifically, and he's concerned about analyzing the passions more closely. And that is, we've alluded to desire and fear, but what more than that? Well, he says that when we look at the passions, we can group them into two distinct categories. When we move towards something, when we're impelled to move towards something which causes that movement, then that passion or that set of passions is called an appetite or a desire. And when the endeavor is fromward something, it's generally called aversion. So the passions are grouped into those that are called appetites or desires, that we move towards them or impelled by that movement towards, and the aversions which tell us to move away. That which men desire, they are also said to love, and to hate those things for which they have aversion. But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he for his part calleth good, and the object of his hate and aversion is evil. So what are good and evil? Plato had made a great deal out of what good and evil were. That is, good and evil represented a kind of transcendent ideal that we could achieve as we moved outside the cave, and the idea, the idea of the good, was that state of perfection. From Hobbes' point of view, forget all of that. That's all nonsense. There is one definition of good and one definition of evil, and that is that good represents that which gives us pleasure, and evil is that which represents pain. We get an early suggestion then, an early development of the pain-pleasure calculus here. That is, that the force of the sovereign and the function of the polis is, from Hobbes' point of view, to give us the kind of pleasure that we need, that is, basic security and order, rather than pain. This basic idea of the passions is, from Hobbes' point of view, described in terms of matter and motion. He says that whether we're looking at an animal or a person, when we experience a desire to move towards something, that's marked, stimulated by an appetite. When we move away from it, it's an aversion. He says, for example, a fire in a room. We come into the room, we're drawn to that fire if it's a cold day. An animal will be drawn to the fire as well as a human being. However, if that fire becomes too hot, if it burns the house down, then we seek to escape it. So the fire can be a source of either goodness or of evil, either appetite or aversion. But what we can say about it for sure is if it gives us pleasure, then it's good. If it allows us to experience evil, then or displeasure or pain, then it's evil. That basic distinction about the body being in a state always of motion, moving toward or away from something, that's right at the basis of Hobbes' thought. It's what we hate or fear is that kind of passion that has to be closely identified. And so Hobbes, as a scientist, thinks of himself as a social political scientist. He looks at human nature and he sees us drawn towards something or moving away from it. And he wonders whether or not a polis, a state, a leviathan can be constructed so that a sovereign may be scientifically analyzed to give more pain than pleasure. And what is it about a polis or a state or a leviathan that can give more pain than pleasure? That's his question. What kind of state may we construct that will allow us to experience our deepest satisfaction in that state? What kind of state then might be constructed that will allow us to achieve security rather than war. And when he speaks about happiness and the way in which individuals are to experience happiness, the Greeks, when they talked about happiness, spoke of it in glorious terms. Remember, that is, happiness for the Greeks was a state in Aristotle of being that one experiences as a result of virtue and the attainment of a high degree of wisdom. And Aristotle says at the end of his Ethics that happiness is that kind of being, that quality of mind that comes only as a result of contemplation, and the philosopher achieves that state of happiness more than others. From Hobbes' point of view, forget that. That definition of happiness is out. He has a realist definition of happiness. And he says simply this: continual success in obtaining those things which a man from time to time desireth, that is to say, continual prospering, is that men call felicity or happiness. I mean the felicity of this life, not a felicity of an afterlife. For there is no such thing, he says, as perpetual tranquility of mind while we live here on earth. Because life itself is but motion and can never be without desire, nor without fear, no more than without sense. So we're products, then, of our sense experience. Life is a continuing state of motion. We either experience pleasure or displeasure. If we experience pleasure, we experience a fulfillment of our desires. If we experience displeasure, it's as a result often of fear, of anxiety, the kind of fear that comes, Hobbes says, especially from civil war. That analysis of the passions, then, it takes us to one of the, I think, most trenchant insights of Hobbes, and that is what passions move us most. What is the strongest appetite and what is the strongest aversion? The passions, he says, that most of all cause the difference of behavior in us are principally, first, desire of power. And by desire of power, he says, I mean desire of riches, of knowledge, of honor. I group that all under desire for power. All which may be reduced to no more than this: the desire for more and more power over others. That's the first passion, the biggest desire, the greatest source of satisfaction and pleasure. Now, what is the second? Every man, Hobbes says in another place now, every man shuns what is evil, but chiefly he shuns the chiefest of natural evils, which is death. And this he doth by a certain impulsion of nature, no less than that whereby a stone moves downward. That is, from Hobbes' point of view, our fear of death is so real, so complete, so total, that just as we know that gravity is going to force a stone downward, so we know that an individual for certain will experience fear of death. In an excellent book on Hobbes by Leo Strauss called The Political Philosophy of Hobbes, Leo Strauss, who taught at the University of Chicago, and I believe I've referred to him in my lecture on Machiavelli, writing not only on Machiavelli now, but on Hobbes, says, for Hobbes, death is the primary, greatest, supreme evil, and aversion from death is the origin and law of the state. Fear of death is a mutual fear. It's also an elemental fear, Strauss says. It's the fear that each man has of every other man as his potential murderer. Now, that's a strong statement. And I recall a while ago a student who had my political theory course at Barnard several years before. We had kept in casual touch, but suddenly out of the blue he calls me and says, Professor Dalton, I want to share with you an experience that I just had. I thought of my political theory course. And I said, well, it's something you thought of the political theory course after all these years. It's good. And he said, yeah, last night I was walking through Central Park, and foolishly, late at night, and suddenly without any warning there was a blade in my throat. And the words, wallet, wallet. Give me your wallet. Well, he said, I hesitated for a moment. Wasn't sure. I didn't want to part with my wallet, but then I felt my heart pounding inside my chest and surrendered the wallet pretty quickly. And he said, I got out of there and I began to think a lot about how I felt at that time. And he said, you know, what I was thinking about in political theory? And I said, well, let's see. It must have been Plato's idea of virtue, or the Aristotelian mean, or maybe Machiavelli's idea of the prince. And he said, no, none of that. I was thinking of Hobbes. And I was thinking of that time that you read this quotation to us from Strauss that said that fear of death is the mutual fear. It's an elemental fear, the fear that each man has of every other man, and how this fear is so primary that it convulses our being. He said, I've never had my heart pound in my chest, anything like that. He said, I'm a pretty passionate guy, but never have I experienced a passion anything like that. And that's precisely what Hobbes is saying. He's saying that there are passions within us. But the strongest passion, and Strauss makes this point, it's not simply self-preservation. Other political theorists have said that. It's more than that. From Hobbes' point of view, it's more elementary than that. It's fear of death, and specifically fear of violent death. Now, when Hobbes speaks of that kind of passion, he says that is the first and foremost of the passions that we have, the fear of violent death. That explains all else. And as Strauss goes on to say, this fear of violent death is for Hobbes the root of all right and all morality. Hobbes ultimately denied the moral value of all virtues that do not contribute to the making of the strong state which can consolidate peace and protect us against the danger of violent death. That's going to take us into lecture number 2, and we'll leave Strauss's last comment, the last part of that comment, to what we'll be talking about in the second lecture on Hobbes. But the point is this, that from Hobbes' point of view, the Armada complex, we justify all morality in terms of how far we can shape a state that will protect us best against violent death and alleviate this terrible anxiety that we have within us of fear that each person, each other man, is our potential murderer. There is no legitimization for the state other than that. Now, Hobbes doesn't start there, of course. He stopped there, rather. I think one of his most ingenious contributions to political philosophy is the way in which he sees the interaction between these two passions. That's the question. That's the problem. That's the stuff of his theory. That is, we have on the one hand, remember how we started, we have the idea that we're sensual rather than rational animals. We have further on the theory that as sensual animals, we're driven by the passions. We're driven either away or towards passions depending on whether they're aversions or appetites. And the strongest, remember, appetite is desire for power. The strongest aversion is fear of violent death. The question is now how these two sets of passions, the aversion and the appetite, interact one with the other. And he addresses this in his chapter 11, I think euphemistically called, and maybe misleadingly called, of the difference of manners, because it's not about manners at all. It's about the way in which individuals interact in society, and power is at the heart of it. He begins in this chapter on the difference of manners by saying that, contrary to what Plato and others have told us, there is no utmost aim, no summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. Felicity, he says, is no more than this. It's a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of one object being still but the way to the next. The cause of man's desire is not to enjoy once only and for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. And therefore the actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to the procuring, but to the assuring of a contented life. Perfectly expressed, it seems to me. You get the point. The point is that happiness is no more than the continual satisfaction of pleasures. Just a full stop. However, when we try to achieve happiness, desperately trying to assure more and more satisfaction of these pleasures, as we try to do that, we know that we cannot ever achieve a state of complete tranquility. That is, never procure enough happiness or satisfaction of pleasures that we will be able to assure a contented life forever. And yet we try. We strive towards it. Why do we try? Why do we pursue this goal? In the first place, he says, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Now that line is often quoted from Hobbes, and we stop there. Not right to stop, because what he says after indicates the way in which the two passions interact. But, he says, the cause of this desire for more and more power is not that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power. It's rather because he cannot assure the power and means to live well which he hath present without the acquisition of more and more and more. Now, why should we do this? Not because we are greedy and avaricious, but rather, Hobbes says, because we are fearful. Because we're caught up in a state of terrible, continuing anxiety. And so he says, man hath this above all in his heart, all day long, gnawed on by fear of death, of poverty perhaps, of some other calamity, but above all, gnawed on by fear of death, and has no repose, no pause of his anxiety, but in sleep. This perpetual fear of death is always accompanying mankind. This is the perpetual fear, then. Now let's think about what Hobbes is saying, because it's new. The basic analysis of the passions is here. That is what I've said. To summarize again, we have this problem, and that is that we are driven to seek greater and greater happiness, greater and greater felicity, but underneath, the reason why we seek this is to assure a state of relative security. It always has to be relative security. The question is why we do this. And Hobbes says the reason why we do it is because we're caught up in a fearful anxiety. And so every expression of our acquisition of more and more power is a reflection of that anxiety. We're not wolves in sheep's clothing. We are sheep in wolves' clothing. And as we aggress and seek to dominate other individuals, we awaken fear in those people, too. The best explanation until recently that we had, it seems to me, of the Cold War. The way in which the attempt was always to get one up on the other, to get more power so that once and for all we would have security, but all the time accumulating only more paranoia, more fear in the other. From Hobbes' point of view, this applies across the board to every kind of aggressive, dominating, belligerent situation. And this is the point, that individuals strive for more and more power because they cannot control this deep-seated anxiety that they have within. Now, when we look at this and apply it to any number of circumstances, it seems to me that we can see the truth in it. There was an article in the New York Times recently that talked about a problem that occurs in my city and that has occurred more each decade, each year, each month recently, and that is the acquisition of firearms, especially by teenagers. The New York Times begins this article, which is titled on the front page of the Times on February 17th, 92, entitled "Teenage Gunslinging Rises." On a shadowy corner in Brooklyn, A gangly teenager slowly opened his jacket to give a peek at the 9mm semi-automatic pistol jammed in the waistband of his jeans. "When you've got it," he said, glancing at his weapon, "you've got the power. It doesn't matter whether you're big or small, you've got the power. You get it, though, because you fear," this is his language, I'm not putting this into the article, "you get it because you fear what is happening out there. Once you have it, you feel like a god. You feel invincible." And the article goes on to comment on the vicious cycle of packing weapons to protect themselves among teenagers in New York City. A precise explanation of exactly what Hobbes is talking about. And that is the way in which fear engulfs a population. And as a result of that fear, in a domestic level, Hobbes is saying we are caught up necessarily in an attempt to get more and more power. I think that the situation applies to the series of events that we are reading about today in the Times, and that is the Middle East crisis. From Hobbes's point of view, this is the problem with the Middle East. Each party is struggling to get more and more power in order to cope with the insecurity that exists in that situation. Hobbes looks at humankind and says that humankind, driven by passions, is not greedy, avaricious, power-seeking its own in a particular sense, in a special sense, power-seeking rather in another sense, and that is the reflection of the fear, the insecurity in each individual. Hobbes's analysis then describes a human predicament. And what is the predicament? The predicament is that we all want peace. We all want security. We all want order. That's our basic requirement. This is what we need more than anything else. And Hobbes, when he speaks about this, insists that the general law of peace and peace-seeking is at the bottom of all human behavior. This is the element need, the aim of individuals. Why is it that we can't get it? Is it because we're aggressive types? No. Hobbes doesn't believe that. Is it because the power drive is there for its own sake? That is, that we're given to grabbing power at every opportunity. Hobbes doesn't believe that. The predicament is much more subtle than that. The predicament is that everywhere we turn, when we strive to gain more and more power, we're creating more and more fear in another individual. And we cannot get out of that vicious cycle. It's that vicious cycle that traps us. It's that human predicament from Hobbes's point of view in which we're caught. We're trapped. Now, how do we get out of this? Well, from Plato's point of view, to come back to his analysis, we get out of a situation of civil war. Plato was born into civil war, into a horrendous crisis. We get out of that crisis through education. We manage to develop reason in individuals, and then we attain higher and higher levels of virtue. From Plato's point of view, that is the only way out. We construct a strong, a powerful leadership of guardians ruled by reason, and we're taken into a whole new world, a world of truth and beauty and justice. From Hobbes's point of view, that is, again, impossible. It's impossible because the nature of human nature and the nature of the human predicament. From his point of view, from this realist point of view, the best that we can do, this will take us into the second lecture, the best that we can do is to control the vicious cycle that we're in now. We must find a way of resolving this problem that occurs within us and within the state of nature. If we cannot do that, if we cannot achieve that, then everything else will fail. So when Plato and Hobbes are at odds on this, they're at odds on what? They're at odds on the nature of human nature, first of all. That is, the passionate, sensual animal as opposed to the rational animal seeking justice. They're not at all at odds in terms of seeking a state of security. But the way out, the way to get the state of security, the way after we've diagnosed the situation, the way to find the remedy, totally in total disagreement. From Hobbes's point of view, there is no discussion of education here at all. Plato's Republic is all about education. That is, it's a book, as Rousseau said. It's the finest treatise on education ever written. Why is it that the two are so different in these terms. From Plato's point of view, what we need is a basic change of self. We must transform the attitudes, the minds of individuals in the polis, and we can do it through a systematic program of education. From Hobbes' point of view, forget that. There's no way that education is ever going to turn a sensual animal into a rational creature. No matter whether we have high levels of education, low levels of education, will be driven by the passions in precisely that same way, will be caught up in the same kind of predicament. What do we want then? We want a way out. We want a diagnosis and a prognosis of the situation that will work. Plato's system, for all of its idealism, its admirable utopianism, cannot work. What will work? Resolve the problem, get us out of the vicious cycle. Hobbes says, passions got us into this mess, and passions will get us out. There will come a time when all of us, fed up once and for all with war, will resolve that we must find a better alternative. It's not through a rational process that this will occur. It's rather quite the opposite, through a contractual process in which individuals gather together, as we'll see, meet together and say, look, we can't take this any longer. We're driven to a desperate state. We need security. We must have security. And so we get the contract. Plato nowhere talks about getting a contract together among sensual or even rational creatures in order to solve his problems. This, as we'll see, is new in Hobbes. When Hobbes talks about the contract, it's about a way of resolving a desperate situation among individuals driven by anger, driven by exasperation, driven by frustration, but above all, they are driven by fear, terrible fear, fear of their potential murderers. Anything, any means is worth getting out of this mess. Peace at any price. And so when Hobbes sets forth his solution, it is not with Plato's stipulation that through education we'll get the state of virtue and all that. We want order, we want security, we want survival, and that's it. This is the basic realist mode of reasoning. And as we saw in the case of Machiavelli, Hobbes, following Machiavelli, said, Plato, would that it could be different. But it's not. It's not, because individuals are what they are. They're driven by these passions, and as passionate creatures, we must find a solution. Are we willing, in the Middle East, or in New York City, or any place else, to find the solution of peace at any price? Are we willing to go for an ultimate remedy that will somehow, in the end, resolve this vicious cycle that we're in? That's the question. As a New Yorker myself, I often think, yes, as I'm walking around the city at night and dark, peace at any price. If one were living in the Middle East now as we face the latest crisis in the Middle East, one too could ask the same question. Do we want peace at any price? Now, what does it mean, peace at any price? It means, as Hobbes will show, a drastic remedy. Because if the diagnosis is of a profound illness, a terrible disease that we're experiencing, if the human predicament is as bad as it is, then it needs drastic and radical surgery. The solution, the remedy, is just around the corner. And we take it up in the second lecture, where Hobbes, the scientist, the physician, tries to help us out, find a way to cope with the state of fear, anxiety, vicious cycle, war, violence, all the rest, in which we are caught up.